Good morning, and thank you all for joining us. We're going to explore the life and times of St. Patrick. St. Patrick is the most famous person associated with Ireland. He is the patron saint of Ireland and is recognized as having played a major role in the Christianization of Ireland. There are many myths and legends associated with Patrick. Patrick was kidnapped in Britain by Irish slave traders and taken to Ireland as a slave at the age of 16. He escaped after 6 years. He returned as a bishop in his 40s and spent 25 years ministering to the existing Christian community in Ireland, mostly foreign slaves and refugees, and helped to convert the indigenous Irish. This presentation will examine the historical context of St. Patrick's mission in Ireland. This includes a review of the development of Irish society prior to his arrival, an overview of the history of Christianity in England and Ireland, an examination of the crises in Europe as the Roman Empire collapsed, and how this all impacted the situation in Ireland in the 4th and 5th centuries. And this program is presented by Sean Murphy, who is a teacher of Irish history, music, and dance, who was born and raised in Dublin and moved to Massachusetts about 18 years ago. So let's see, everyone on the line, pretty good crowd for a Thursday morning. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. And let's give a big virtual round of applause to Sean for joining us this morning. Sean, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. And welcome, everybody. And happy St. Patrick's Day to you all. Robert has given you an overview of what I intend to do in the next hour or so. There's a lot in there, but we're talking about the life and the times of St. Patrick. I'm giving you the historical record, some of it because we don't have a lot of accurate historical records from the time. Some of it is disputed. There are different variations that you will find depending upon the book you read. So I'm just alerting you to the fact that, you know, everything that I say may not be what you have previously read. Certainly, if the only thing you've read was the Christian narrative that was written in the around the 6th, 7th century, and which hasn't really changed, you know, since then. And obviously with the changes within the world and society and people's understanding and development of science and the rest, a lot of it is a narrative that really related to people's expectations based upon the Old Testament and New Testament. And also simplifications for people in terms of understanding. So I'm going to give you more history than fiction or narrative. So with that being said, I will go now and share my screen and get started. So my introductory slide here, it has a quote from Patrick himself. Later on, I'll be introducing you to two of the works that are generally accepted as having originated from him. We don't have the original copies. They were written at a time when the origin story for Christianity in Ireland was written around the late 6th, 7th century. So this, we're pretty sure, is something that he did write. I am Patrick, a sinner, most uncultivated and least of all the faithful, and despised in the eyes of many. So you might wonder, you know, why he would start his letter in that way. And I will explain that as we go along. So a lot of times his family is left out of it. So I'm going to begin with a couple of slides. And just like everything else in my presentation, it's a summary, it's an introduction. There's a lot more to it. And I hope that if you get a copy of the presentation, you'll be able to use the resources that I have attached either to each slide or at the end. So first thing to note is Patrick was not Irish and his name wasn't Patrick. His name, in fact, was Maewyn Sacat Patricius. The Patricius was the name that he got, which refers to the patrician order in Rome, and it was a title that was granted to him at a later stage when he became a bishop, and it's from that Patrick came from. And he wouldn't have been called Patrick in Ireland in those days. He would have been called Pádraig, because Patrick is the anglicization of the Irish Pádraig. He was from a Romano, British Christian missionary family, because the Romans had invaded and taken control of the island of Britain in the middle of the 1st century. And they left in the year 410. So they were there in control for around 300 years. Key thing to remember is who were the main people in Ireland at this time? Of the indigenous people that were in Ireland, they were Celts. Where did they come from? Well, they came from Europe. And why did they come? A lot of them arrived in Ireland because they were displaced as a result of the advance of the Roman armies throughout Europe. So that meant that those people in Ireland had no desire to see a Roman army ever come to Ireland. And one of the things that they did was they devised a strategy which was essentially to attack the Roman army and its administration on the island of Britain, as well as on the western coast of Europe. And so the Romano British communities along the west coast of Britain were an obvious target. And I'll be talking about that again in a moment. So he's known as the Apostle of Ireland, and he's the primary patron saint along with Bridget and Columba, who were both Irish. Bridget, in fact, while she was Irish, her mum was from modern day Portugal, and her mum was a slave. So where was he born? We're not sure. Some people believe he was born in Scotland around Kilpatrick around the year 385. Others claim that it was Wales. In his writings, he tells us that it was in the village of Banavente, Bernia, but unfortunately, we have never been able to track that down. And as you can imagine, if somebody could say this is where Patrick was born, that would be enough to guarantee commercial success for that area for a long, long time. His parents were Calpurnius and Conchessa. His father was a deacon. His grandfather was Palladius, was a priest. There's evidence that some of his siblings and their offspring worked alongside him in Ireland, and that's why I'm including them. If they hadn't been involved, I wouldn't have there'd be no point in introducing you to them. One of them was Saint Mel, who apparently had organized the boat that brought him. So Saint Mel of Ardagh and his brothers Melchu, Munis, and Rioch, it is said that they accompanied Patrick when he made his trip to Ireland as a bishop. But the most famous of them all is Dorerca, who was a sister of St. Patrick. There's debate about whether she was a blood sister or a religious sister. We don't know. What we do know is that she is known as the mother of saints because of her children. She had 17 sons and 2 daughters, and most of them entered religious life. Many later were recognized as saints, and several of her sons became bishops. She will be honored in a few days' time, on the 22nd of March, and she's the patroness of Valentia Island, which is off the coast of County Kerry. Back to St. Mel, he helped evangelize Ireland while supporting himself through manual labor. Now, the reason why that's significant is that, as you know, there's been schisms and divisions within the Christian church from literally day one. When the Roman church became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the strategy changed from evangelizing by just moving around, talking to ordinary people and converting them, like a mass movement of just ordinary people. Now it was the religion of the elites who did obviously no manual labor. So people like Mel still honor the old tradition, as well as the fact that by working, it meant, and he was one of those whose approach was, we will never become a burden on the people that we're trying to evangelize. You know, we're not looking for handouts from them. We will work our own way through this. Patrick appointed him as one of the earliest Irish bishops and head of the Diocese of Ardagh. You may have heard of the Ardagh Chalice, and that's where that comes from. Mel was also involved in the building of the monastery there, and he was both a bishop and an abbot, because you had 2 distinct systems in Ireland. You had the Roman-based system of dioceses and parishes, and then you had the monastic system built around monasteries. So in some cases, the overlap meant that you were both a bishop and an abbot. because the place was both a monastery and a parish and a diocese. One of the things that he's famous for, in fact, is the fact that he was the one who accepted St. Bridget's profession as a nun, and he served as her mentor. The issue here was that Bridget was finding it difficult to get any man, I suppose, who was high up in the church to accept her wishes, which was to serve in the church. So Mel was the one who did it. And in fact, he ended up making her a bishop. And when that was brought to his attention, because there was a rite, a passage, if you like, that had to be gone through, and for whatever reason, he brought her through the rite for being a bishop rather than a nun or a priest. And when it pointed out to him that he had made a mistake, he said, "No, I haven't made a mistake." He says, "If I did so, well, then that was God's wishes, and I am not going to undo the wishes of God." So for the next literally 600 to 700 years, at all of the synods, which were the meetings of the hierarchy of the church, there was always the successor to Bridget at those. It wasn't until the year 1111 when the church changed from being a monastic system to a diocesan-based one. In other words, Rome had established its superiority within the Irish church. One of the first things they did was got rid of the idea, well, not the idea, but the practice of having a woman attend the synod meetings. And St. Mel, his feast day is February the 7th. It's a holiday for single people, a day for people to celebrate the good things about being single, and things like sending yourself a Christmas card and having a party for your single friends. So that's just a quick introduction. There's a lot more there, and some of the references that I've given you may help. I do a full program on his family, and maybe we'll do that some stage. So now let's get on to Patrick himself. We know he was a slave, and we know he escaped Ireland. How do we know? Well, we know from one of his own writings, the Confessio. It's accepted that it was written by him, and when the origin story for the Roman Christian Church in Ireland was written, they obviously made Patrick the central character within that, and the Confessio which he wrote, we're not too sure how much of it is the actual writings of Patrick and how much was added to in terms of the origin story, and that's quite usual. Anywhere that the origin story is written, if it's based upon previous writings, the people who are writing the origin story will change it to suit the narrative that they wish to convey. But this part, we believe, is true. He was captured by Irish, sometimes called pirates, but the reality was that the Irish kings who were Celts were trying to make sure that the Romans would not invade Ireland. One way to do that was to continually destabilize the Roman communities on the west coast of Britain. And it was on one of those destabilizing operations, which usually ended up with them capturing people and bringing them back and using them as slaves in Ireland. And one of the people who came was Patrick. So he ended up then serving as a slave, herding and tending sheep in Dalriada, which is in the north of Ireland, in Antrim. So he was owned by a local king. Ri is the Irish word for king. And there were about 150 of the different types, because it was a different level of kings, but they all call themselves kings. And then there was the high king, of course, over them all. Miliach MacBaun, and he ruled some hills in Antrim. Now, he tells us in the Confessio that he began to pray, and he also tells us that he had never paid much attention to the teachings of his religion, even though his father and grandfather were involved. He even tells us that he didn't really believe in God, and he found priests foolish. So one of the reasons that we believe that this is true is that it's unlikely, if you are writing, the origin story for the development of Christianity in Ireland, that you would that you would begin by writing something, like that. You might want to censor that, but anyway, it's there, so we believe it to be true. So that's Slemish or Slieve Mish, where he worked. So that's the legendary first place. So he worked there from the ages of 16 to 22. Now that's critical in terms of the overall story of Patrick, because that was the years when he would have gone to the equivalent of high school and college. And of course, to progress through the church in terms of the requirements for education, Patrick had lost a lot, and he found it very, very difficult to progress through the church because of that. And we'll see in one of the final slides in this section, how that came to be, if you like, a way of discrediting Patrick on behalf of some of the ecclesiastical authorities, because they didn't think they didn't think he should have been allowed to come to Ireland because he wasn't educated enough. So he tells us, we know it was 6 years, and if any of you have been to Ireland, you know the kind of cold, damp weather and the existence that a shepherd would have had in isolation, probably with just one other person. Now, the narrative that we have is that eventually he received in his sleep an otherworldly experience, telling us that a mysterious voice said to him, "Your hungers are rewarded, you are going home." Now, this is the part of the narrative that again suggests that in order to create an explanation for why he left, that somebody took a bit of artistic license. If you did that, and there are plenty of there, in terms of the writing of Irish history, we have many examples of this, where they delved into the language and the structures and the methodology of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in those, it was common for saints, for people who became saints, to have visions, to hear things, to see things. So again, in explaining what happened to Patrick here, we get this. Now, what we do know, and what I believe to be the case, is that what happened was around this time, the High King of Ireland, Niall of the Nine Hostages, was assassinated. Niall of the Nine Hostages was one of the greatest high kings ever in Ireland. And at the time, he was one of the strongest and most well-known kings throughout Europe. And he was killed in the Alps, and he was killed while he was out fighting the Romans. But he wasn't killed by a Roman. In fact, he was killed by an Irishman. He was killed by somebody acting on the orders of the King of Leinster, who had a beef with Niall. That was totally unexpected. And as you can imagine, in those days, for your high king to suddenly be killed, and possibly as well knowing that he was killed by a fellow countryman, that created political turmoil. One of the results of that political turmoil was that everybody was trying to take advantage of it, including slaves. So it's likely that Patrick took advantage of that and managed to make the journey to the southeast coast of Ireland, where he escaped. So he was a fugitive slave. He was never intercepted, stopped, or otherwise approached, which was almost impossible to achieve. So that would have meant that he had to have some help. And that suggests that there was what we might call an underground railroad. We do know that there would have been people who operated in Ireland on behalf of those who were trying to retrieve relatives, because one of the first things that you would do if you were wealthy and your relatives were taken as slaves to Ireland is you would send emissaries over offering a ransom for their release. And that had to be processed, because somebody in Ireland then had to find out where your relatives would have gone to, make introductions, make contacts or whatever. So there was probably a fairly well established network. And maybe also inside of that, there may have been people who were helping slaves to escape. Of course, of significance in the 6 years, Patrick, he said he became fluent in the Irish language. He learned Irish culture and history and developed an affinity towards the people of Ireland. And this was important, because at the end of the day, it is likely that this was the reason why he managed to persuade the authorities in the Roman Church to send him. because we know he lacked in terms of the educational qualifications, and he had to do all sorts of things to make sure he became a priest, and to become a bishop for somebody with his background was almost unheard of. So it's likely that having these on his CV, he managed to persuade. And it was likely at that time that the issue was, we have to send somebody to Ireland, and we might as well give him a chance, or we don't have anybody who's really up to the job, so we let Patrick, because he says he knows something about the country. It was probably that type of discussion. Now, he had learned some skills when he was a shepherd. He would have handled dogs. Now, he approached the captain of a ship, and of course, the captain of a ship, it would be a serious crime to help a slave escape. So what Patrick tells us, that he was turned away, he walked off, started praying, and then sometime later, the sailors from the ship came to him and says, "Come on board, we'll take you in trust." And it's possible that it was his skills in working with dogs that helped him to be accepted, and for him to take that risk. We're told, he tells us in his work that he's traveled for 3 days, and when he arrived, what he found was devastation. That's his own words. Now, why would there be devastation? But it's likely that after 3 days, because 3 days would have been too long for them just to go to England, because some of the books you'll read say that he went to England. I don't believe that. 3 days would have brought him to modern day France. Also, there was no devastation in England at that time, but there was in Gaul, because what was happening was from the east of Europe, and from further east and from the north, there were pagans who were fleeing the Huns. And in the year 407, the River Rhine froze, and people were able to cross that. And as they crossed it, they invaded Gaul. At this stage, both Britain and Gaul had been taken over by the Romans. At this stage, the Roman Church was the official religion of the Roman Empire. So all these people essentially were Christian. So these pagans invaded, and they displaced the people, leaving it in devastation. So where did a lot of these people go? Well, my belief is that quite a substantial number of them ended up in Ireland as refugees and asylum seekers. We'll come back to that in a moment. So Patrick tells us they walked for about 2 weeks. They found nothing to eat. And of course, there was no way they were going to kill and eat dogs, because the dogs were more valuable than the men. So the captain taunted Patrick and says, "How about it, Christian? You say your God is all powerful." So what happened anyway was that a few minutes later, they heard a herd of pigs in front of them, and they managed to get some of those, and that sorted out their hungers and the dog's hunger. So Patrick, we don't know why, but a short while after we know he left that group and headed back towards England, towards Britain, because England wasn't a country yet. England had not been formed, so it was still Britain. Now, you heard about the story about the snakes, so I'm going to give you my take on that. So it's likely that rather than turn around and go back over the devastated land on his own, it would make more sense that he would go around the coast, because the coast was not as devastated, because people would have gravitated towards the coast. And also there was a chance that he would be able to get on board a ship that would take him to Britain. Now, we know that around that time, there was an abbot called Honoratus, and he was in the process of constructing a monastery. Now, the first job that had to be done was to clear the area of snakes and reptiles. Now, the area was Lairns, which is modern day Cannes, where the International Film Festival is held. So Honoratus was taking anybody who was willing to work at this job, because that was the only job that was available at this stage. Before any construction could happen, the land had to be cleared. There's a book by a woman, Hamilton, and she writes that Honoratus was winning a reputation for driving its booming population of vipers into the sea. And she wrote that it is not impossible or unreasonable to assume that Patrick might have sought refuge on Lairns. Now, we know it took him a number of years to get back to Britain, so it's possible that he spent a year or two on the island. And it was a dangerous job. You would have had snake bites because it was just an occupational hazard, but they probably had ways to deal with that. So my take on it is that years later, when he arrived in Ireland, probably at the end of the day, when they had done whatever work they were doing and sitting around having a meal and relaxing for the afternoon and swapping stories, probably Patrick's favorite story, or one of his favorite stories, would be to tell people about his time on this island clearing snakes, and that just developed. And we know there was never any snakes in Ireland, so it doesn't make sense that it would be referring to Ireland. Certainly, Lairens would make sense. And if you note, in the middle of Lairens is Éireann. Éireann's the old name for Ireland. So somewhere along the line, something might have been lost either in translation, or it may have been convenient because it also allowed people then to interpret his driving of snakes to mean the driving out of pagans. But anyway, so he did make it home. His parents were happy to see him and they didn't want him to leave. But he says that after having discovered God while he was in Ireland, he wanted to become a member of the church. And he knew that it was going to be a difficult job, but he said that his life was changed forever, and that was what he was going to do. Eventually, we are told, and again, we're not too sure how much of this part is true, but it answers the question about why he returned to Ireland. So this is what he says, or what's written. It says, I saw a man coming, as it were, from Ireland. His name was Caroticus. And we know that he was familiar with this person because Caroticus was somebody that he knew while he was in Ireland. And Caroticus was carrying many letters, and he gave one of them, and the heading was The Voice of the Irish. And Patrick then tells us, as I began the letter, I imagine in that moment that I heard the voice of those very people who were near the wood of Foclute, which is beside the Western Sea. And they cried out as with one voice, we appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us. And this was in his dream. And we all know we dream, intensely at times. Doesn't mean that God has come into our head, but the whole idea here of this is that God had come into his head and was putting this message, in there. We know today that that's not true, that, it's basically a thought. Now, whether that it's, there's no reason to disbelieve that happened, but it's a suitable way to answer the question, what motivated him to come to Ireland. So let's look a little bit closer then at Ireland and Christianity. Now, unfortunately, the Christian history of Ireland, as written by the Roman Catholic Church, ignores the earlier developments within the church, partly because once the Roman Church became the Church of the Roman Empire, they tried to bring all the different Christian groups together at the Synod of Nicene in the year 325. And some Christian groups did not want to participate, and they were then labeled as heretics. And what was even worse then was that they were declared even worse than pagans. So the issue here is that one of the reasons why the early Christian church in Ireland is discounted is because they were all seen as heretics by the Roman Church. And so you don't really talk about them. Now, what do we have then to show us that there were Christians in Ireland before Patrick? So there's evidence that the church had been established in Ireland possibly since around the 1st century AD, as it happened on the neighboring island of Britain. Now, it is said that St. James visited Ireland in the 1st century, and on leaving, he left behind an organization that was headed by his father, Zebedee. Now, St. James is important. You've all heard of Guinness. Well, to get into the Guinness factory, you have to go through St. James's Gate. Now, St. James's Gate is famous because from the 8th century up to about the 14th to 15th century, you had Irish people who would go on pilgrimage to Spain, because St. James is the patron saint of Spain. And they would gather and leave from St. James's Gate. Also, when they arrived, they would have to go through medical checks and whatever. And there was a place close by which later became known as St. James's Hospital. And it's still there today as St. James's Hospital, and St. James's Gate is still there. Now, so getting on then to other things that are important in terms of establishing that there was, if you like, a duopoly, that there were two traditions in Ireland. What's key here is that we know that the teachings of Saint John, he had spread the word of Christ to Africa and Asia. And we know that there were practices in Ireland that related to St. John, and they were different from those that came from Rome, from Peter and Paul. The key ones were the dating of Easter, and that didn't get resolved for centuries. So the fact, because the reality is, if Rome, if Patrick was the first one to bring Christianity to Ireland, well, then the Roman position on the dating of Easter would have been accepted. The fact that it wasn't clearly is an indication that there was another tradition there. One of the other issues that they had was the haircut. The Roman haircut was to basically cut that bald patch on the top of your head. The tradition from Africa and Asia, which had inspired Ireland, was a different haircut. And there were a number of other issues as well, but we can see clearly that there were a couple of traditions within Ireland. What do we learn from the Irish legends and the annals, which again are something which it's very hard to substantiate them, but again, they're there, and they were compiled from the oral records. One of the things that we are told is about the death of the King Cormac MacNessa. Now, he was a king in the time of Christ. And the story is that Cormac, again, he would have been supplying soldiers who were fighting against the Romans. His military commander had been kidnapped, not kidnapped, but had been taken prisoner in Rome. In the Middle East. And on the day that Christ was being crucified, the Romans decided that they would bring a representative from every nation that they held captive to see this and witness it. And the person representing Ireland was the commander from that worked for Cormac MacNessa. So what happened was, we don't know how, but he managed to return to Ireland. And he recounted the story to the king. The king became so upset about the story that he got up and he went jumping and ranting and raving around the place. Problem was, poor Cormac had a piece of shrapnel in his head from an incident at some stage. And of course, with all this jumping about in fury, the shrapnel moved and he died of a brain bleed. About 300 years later or more, Cormac MacArt, another great High King of Ireland, he apparently was killed by the Druids. And the reason that they killed him was because he had converted to Christianity. And this again is, 60, 70 years before Patrick arrived in Ireland. And just as a total, aside, well, what are the most famous Irish boys' names? It's not Peter and Paul. It's Sean and Seamus. Sean is John and Seamus is James. So I settle my case. Now, of course, the other issue, and we know this because history hasn't been totally rewritten, we know that before Patrick arrived, before the Roman Church arrived, there were already a number of Irish Christian leaders there, Albi, Declan, Kieran, Ibarus, all of whom were later elevated as saints. Now, the elevation of saints in those days, it wasn't until around the 11th, 12th century that Rome took over the job of, if you like, of making people saints. Before that, you could be made a saint by what was called acclamation. So if you are well enough known and people thought you should be a saint, acclamation was the way. So all of these were elevated saints, including Patrick, because Patrick was never made a saint by Rome. It was by acclamation. So again, the relationship between Ireland and Rome, between Celts and Rome, is again a very important one in considering all of this. And as I said earlier, Ireland was fighting against the Roman Empire. It had alliances in northern Britain, which is modern day Scotland, Gaul, modern day France, and as far away as North Africa for centuries. So let's have a look at it. What happened that the Christian church became the Church of the Roman Empire? For the first 3 centuries, persecution of Christians was widespread. But by the year 250, it became official policy within the Roman Empire. And for the next 50, 60 years, things were horrendous. What happened then was Constantine, who was based on the island of Britain, he was acclaimed emperor in the field by his soldiers. Now, this occasionally happened, and it was a way in which soldiers could make their feelings known in Rome. In other words, we're not happy with the fact that you guys over there are having a great time while we're out here being slaughtered. And we want to replace you by somebody who understands the reality. And that happened in the Roman Empire on a number of occasions. So Constantine then was acclaimed emperor in the field. Problem was, to become emperor, he had to make his way to Rome, and he had to defeat anyone who challenged him, and he had to then be accepted within Rome. To do that, he needed an army, and a big army. So my belief is that what happened was that, coming from a Christian country, Britain, then he would have to move to another Christian country in Gaul, that because there was a tradition within the early Christians of refusing to fight. You know, they would not get involved for instance, in the war between the Jews and the Romans. They stood aside. They were kind of, if you like, pacifist or whatever. But now, because they were under such persecution, they had a motivation. And I believe that what happened was Constantine promised them, if you fight for me, we'll fight as a Christian army. And if we win, I will stop the persecution of Christians, and I will make Christianity legal. So that's what happened. He won, and Christianity did become legal. In the year 325, he called the first conference at Nicene, from which the Nicene Creed comes from. In other words, the I believe, or the original version of that came from. But he wasn't successful in unifying all of the varying Christian groups. It was the group in Rome that he built around, and any of the others then who weren't prepared to accept the leadership from Rome and accept the direction that Constantine wanted it to go in, and the other church leaders who were supporting Constantine, they then were declared to be heretics. Then over time, things developed, and eventually by 380, Christianity was made the official religion of the Roman Empire by Emperor Theodosius. To give you an idea, in terms of timeline, it was around then that Patrick was born, around 386. Then the Germanic forces sacked Rome in 410, and to defend Rome, then they had to withdraw troops from all over the place, including Britain. And that was the last time that soldiers from Britain left and didn't return. And that then created a situation where the pagan Angles and the Saxons and the rest, came into Britain, and for the next couple of hundred years, then Britain was de-Christianized by the pagans. Another date that's of interest is 476, because Odoacer, who was a Goth, a German, he forced Romulus Augustus, who was the last Western Roman emperor, to abdicate. And of course, at this stage, Constantine, seeing what was happening anyway within the Roman Empire, had decided to relocate in Constantinople, which is called after him in Turkey. Now, the Etiquette of Thessalonica, it was what made the Nicene Christianity, as it was known at that stage, the state church. They decided to change the name from Nicene Christianity to Catholic, because Catholic was simply the Latin word for universal, and then that was associated then. And that then provided the impetus for church leaders in Rome to assert their dominance over the various branches of the Christian church around the world. Any that didn't accept that, as I said, then were excommunicated and were declared heretics. Now, another significant event happened in 429 that's of relevance to what happened in Ireland. The Pope from Rome sent his main man in Europe, Saint Germanus, to Britain, because at this stage in Britain you had a strong Christian group who differed with Rome on original sin. And so St. Germanus came essentially to get them to agree to accept the Roman way. Now, there were some in Britain who refused to do that, and all of them were exiled. And we believe that they came to Ireland. So remember, the Roman Church became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, we know Ireland was never controlled by the Roman Empire. And the strategy was to convert within the Roman Empire. So we have to explain now why they came to Ireland, which was not part of the Roman Empire. So let's look at who were Christians in Ireland at this stage. There were slaves. Many of them were ones who were, captured in Britain and Gaul over the years. Also, then you would have had Irish mercenary soldiers fighting for Rome, and maybe some of them fighting against Rome, because mercenary soldiers would fight for whoever pays them. So there would have been some of them returning who had been exposed. Some of them may have returned with spouses and families that were Christian. Traders, because there was a lot of trading going on, and there were free Irish people at this time, and some of those would have converted. And of course, then we know of the work of the missionaries active in Ireland before Patrick. They had converted people. And then, of course, the refugees and asylum seekers that were coming from the Christianized Europe following the invasion and migration of the Germanic peoples, they again would have added to that. And of course, now on top of that, in the previous year or two, were all those Christians from Britain who had been exiled because they refused to accept the Roman ruling. So let's have a look now at how Patrick converted the Irish. It wasn't an easy job. He was from Rome, and given the hostility that there would have been between Rome and the Celts, and because the Celts were, who arrived in Ireland had been forced out of their own lands, they would have had no desire to be overtaken by anything to do with Rome. And remember, Patrick would have been representing the Roman Empire at this time, because the church was the official religion of the Roman Empire. Because at the time that he arrived, while the Roman Empire was under significant, pressure and was in decline, it was still a threat. So he says, "Daily I am expected to be slain or set upon or reduced to slavery," because he knew that in challenging paganism and in challenging the tradition in Ireland, that there were going to be issues. Now, Cardinal Cushing has a nice way of putting it, and I think it will get across to you what I've been trying to explain to you in the last 15, 20 minutes. He said, "It was in an era of alarming crisis that Pope Celestine I sent Patrick to Ireland, an era of confusion and in fact, I've got a tab here that's over this, and I can't read it, but you can probably read it. But it explains, accurately the chaos that was in Europe and Ireland at the time. So, what was his role? Well, the short while before Patrick, the Pope had sent a person called Palladius. Now, Palladius was somebody who really wasn't suited for Ireland. He enjoyed the fine living and the fine dining and the nice wines and whatever. And there's a good portrayal of him in a movie that was made in 1999, in which Alan Bates, Susanna York, various other people are in, and you can get it free on YouTube. So Palladius didn't last very long. He arrived in Ireland, and the scene in the movie, which is probably pretty accurate, shows him arriving, getting off the boat in his finery, and within minutes he's up to his neck in mud and muck, and the Irish are laughing at him, at the state of him. And anyway, he didn't get on very well and left. Then the issue was, we have to send somebody to replace him. Because the issue for Rome was, we cannot allow a Christian Ireland to develop that is not under the control of Rome. So Palladius had failed. This was Patrick's opportunity. And Patrick, as you would see in the movie, and I believe it to be quite an accurate portrayal, he was able to persuade him that he was the man for the job. He had been to Ireland, he knew people there, he knew the way of life, he knew how to get things done there, and he was anxious and willing to go there. There was one slight hiccup in that as a result of the Roman Church coming to Britain and making a deal with the ecclesiastic authorities in Britain, one of the things that was agreed on was that they would have to approve an appointment to Ireland. So they had to approve Patrick's appointment. They didn't want to do that because, as far as they were concerned, Patrick was not the man for the job, partly because of his education. He wasn't educated well enough. So that would have been a big part of it. There was also another issue that arose, which had to do with confession. At some point in his life, Patrick committed something and he confessed, and that confession then became known to the ecclesiastical authorities in Britain, because at the time confessions weren't private. In fact, it was Patrick who took the lead in basically making confessions private. He was the one who basically got that development. So there were a number of reasons why they didn't want him to come to Ireland. Now, we're told that the reason he came to Ireland was to strengthen the local Christian community. When he came to align the Christian community in Ireland with Rome. And as we know from what I told you already, the community in Ireland at this stage was a mix of converted Irish Christian slaves, refugees, asylum seekers, and those people who had arrived from Britain. He spent about 20 years preparing for a missionary role in the church. He was initially confined to the role as a brother due to his lack of education. He was eventually made a priest and then made a bishop, because the other side of sending somebody to Ireland, you couldn't send somebody of a lowly status. So it was the opportunity presented itself to him. When they accepted that they wanted to send him, they had to make him a bishop. They couldn't send a priest. That would not be something that would make sense. So the British they didn't have a veto on what Rome wanted. So they approved it, but they weren't in favor of his promotion. So Patrick then, when he came to Ireland, and when he moved around, when he got set up and started to move around, Cardinal Cushing, he tells us, he brought with him no less than 24 persons, and often up to 100. And the group usually included an assistant bishop, a chaplain, several young men whom Patrick was preparing for the priesthood, a brehon, which is the Irish word for judge, to advise him on legal matters, builders, masons, smiths, metal workers, chariot and wagon drivers, a cook, most importantly, a brewer, table attendants, a sacristan, embroidery workers, and of course, a palmist, who would be the custodian of the sacred books. It's thought that Patrick may have supplemented his church resources with some personal wealth. But what we do know is that wealthy Irish nobility, particularly women, provided resources for his work. I don't have time to go into it in detail here. I do it in another lecture, but essentially what happened here was that women, particularly women of the Irish nobility, were fed up with a situation where there were pawns in a game, essentially where their fathers would settle disputes with people by marrying them off, and that then would put them into a cycle of what they consider to be a perpetual pregnancy. So when they got word of Patrick and his notion, which was central to his work, about being a bride of Christ, a lot of them says, yes, I'll be a bride of Christ. And if I'm a bride of Christ, well, then then my father can't force me to be a bride of somebody else. And to help in that work and to get that established, they were prepared to put their money, because one of the things at this stage in Ireland was that women had the right to their own wealth. and they could use that wealth the way they wished. It wasn't the property of their husbands, as it became under English common law. So, what was his mission? Well, you may have read the famous book by Cal, which is how the Irish saved civilization. So he suggests that because of his knowledge of the Irish language and culture, he was sent to provide support, starting in Northern Ireland. There's two reasons for Northern Ireland. One was because it was decided when he came, he was going to go back to the man who owned him and repay him for whatever he had lost as a result of him having absconded. But also, because of the work of the other Christians, Patrick was not allowed to go into Munster and other parts of the south. He was only allowed to go into Northern Ireland, Ulster, and the Midlands. Also, Cal tells us that he would have sought permission from local kings, because you couldn't just walk. If you wanted this to work, you were going to have to get people on your side. And again, the tradition at this stage in Rome was to get the wealthy and the rulers on your side. So that's what Patrick was doing. So he tried to convert, and he did convert some kings, and he sought assistance then of local kings, because when he moved on beyond their borders, he essentially needed a reference, and they were prepared to give him that. There's another book by a guy called Freeman, and he tells us that Patrick succeeded by using a slow and steady approach with a careful eye on the practical politics of Irish society. And we know from Patrick's letters that he tells us that he made payments to local kings to gain their favor and protection. That did not go down too well with the ecclesiastical authorities in Britain, partly because they didn't think he should be paying anybody. And the other reason was, and this was an ongoing issue, Patrick was using the donations that were given to him in Ireland to build his church in Ireland, and he wasn't sending anything to them in England or to Britain. So they were upset about that. But what we know is that Patrick apparently chose not to be confrontational or dogmatic. He wanted to demonstrate Christian morality and principles, and he wanted that to be demonstrated in the way that he approached his work. And so he was going to lead from the front. Now, we know that Patrick, along with other missionaries, they spread Christian teachings throughout the country by preaching, writing, and by performing lots of baptisms. They were helped by the fact that the Irish people and pagans, obviously all over the world, are very religious people. And their religion also involved an understanding of what we term transcendentalism. So issues related to the hereafter and that they understood. So you just had to give your formulation, to them. And the things that I suppose helped Patrick, one was his relationship, to women, offering them the alternative. The other was his efforts to end slavery, because obviously a lot of the Christians in Ireland at the time were slaves. So that would be very, very appealing to them to support him and Rome by saying that he wanted to end slavery. And then he recognized the spiritual practices that were already there, and he incorporated those in the church. He didn't come over heavy-handed and tell them, you have to stop doing this, you must forget that, whatever. He incorporated them in a way that allowed people to understand, I suppose, what was common between their beliefs and the church, and to allow them to progress. There's nothing better than the famous Patrick's Celtic cross that shows that, because that was renowned for it combined the native sun worshipping ideology along with the Christian cross. So a quick look at his achievements. As I said, his achievements were essentially in Northern, Central, and Eastern Ireland. He structured the church by locating bishops close to the sites of provincial kings. He couldn't set up new dioceses and new parishes. The clan system in Ireland was unbreakable. So he located it within the boundaries of the clan system in Ireland. So the boundaries then corresponded with the petty kingdoms in Ireland. Because he was from Rome, he obviously then was the number one, the highest ranking bishop in Ireland, and he chose Armagh as his site. Obviously, the fact that he couldn't go to the south meant that he didn't choose Cashel. And for centuries, the issue was whether Armagh or Cashel should be the central site for the Christian religion in Ireland. And it wasn't until centuries much later, and in fact, it wasn't really until Brian Boru around the year 1002, when Brian Boru went to Armagh and signed the book there and recognized Armagh as the leading place for the church, that that debate was kind of ended, if you like. Now, it's interesting that there were no church martyrs from the time. And that is taken to indicate that the pagan rulers allowed him to carry out his mission, obviously with some restrictions and some difficulties. But if there had been church martyrs, we know that the narrative and the origin story for the arrival of Christianity in Ireland would have been based upon them, as it is in many countries where there were many church martyrs. So the fact that the narrative or the origin story in Ireland is not based around martyrs is taken as proof positive that there were no significant numbers of martyrs. There were a few people killed, like Patrick's chariot. His chariot driver was one of the ones who was killed, but again, he wasn't a missionary. Also, as I said earlier, there is an allusion to the fact that he expected to be martyred and he welcomed the prospect. Now, the issue is, of course, by the time that he died, how much of Ireland was converted? And again, some people tell us, I'll be going on to that in a moment, but the reality is that he hadn't succeeded in converting the whole of Ireland, nor in reconciling the secular authorities in Ireland to Christianity. That's pretty clear. Now, he did support church officials. He created councils. He founded monasteries. He organized Ireland into dioceses, although the dioceses were based upon the boundaries of the clan structure. Interestingly, after he died in the 6th century, there was a law laid down, and it laid down a code of conduct for Christians towards their pagan neighbors. And this was not telling them you have to go out and convert them, and that you have to do everything in your power to undermine them and convert them. No, this was toleration. Now, Cardinal Cushing tells us in he's written a book, the whole island was Catholic, and the saint, before he died, had consecrated 350 bishops, ordained over 5,000 priests, and built more than 700 churches. So we know that the island wasn't fully Catholic, but certainly the other figures that are printed they would be accepted. What it means, of course, if you built 700 churches in 25 years, that meant there was a huge economic boom in Ireland at the time. And we know that for the next 3 centuries, Ireland was known as the island of saints and scholars. Ireland was in Renaissance while the rest of Europe was in decline. They call it the Dark Ages. Now let's have a look at his writings. There were 2 writings, the first of which was called The Letter to the Soldiers of Caroticus. Now, Caroticus was a king on the island of Britain. Caroticus was a Christian. His soldiers were a Christian. What happened was Patrick had just been to a village or a townland on the northeast coast of Ireland, and he had converted the people there. He headed off then to some place not far away, and on his way, a messenger caught up with him and informed him that shortly after he had left, some soldiers had arrived, and they had kidnapped all of the people who he had just baptized and had taken them and were taking them to the slave markets. So that created a big issue for Patrick, because even at this stage, Patrick was in a situation where the pagan and secular authorities in Ireland, while they were apparently tolerating, his work. In one sense, what they were waiting for was for his work to collapse on its own merits, if you like. So they were waiting for something to happen that would demonstrate to people that he was some kind of a fake, or that he couldn't be relied upon. So at this point, he realized that the whole country, if you like, and everybody was looking at him to see what he was going to do. Now, the problem was he did respond. The first thing he did was he sent people over to Caroticus with an offer to pay ransom for the release. Caroticus basically said, no, and if you don't get out of here now, I'm going to hang on to you and you'll never see Ireland again. Now, he decided then that he would write a letter. Problem with that was the protocol at the time was that he needed to contact the ecclesiastical authorities in Britain and ask them to intervene and sort the matter out. Patrick's reasoning was that that's going to take too long, and by the time that they do anything, all of these people will be on their way to the Far East or China as slaves or whatever, and they'll never see Ireland again. Also, he realized that a lot of the church authorities, particularly in the area controlled by Caroticus, would probably not be able to do anything because they would be fearful of what Caroticus could do to them, and probably they relied upon him for security. So he sent a letter, and it's described as at once a decree of excommunication, because again, it was directed to try to separate Caroticus, who was a Christian, from his soldiers. The idea was that Caroticus should be put under pressure and he should be excommunicated for that. Now, if you were a leader of Christian soldiers who was excommunicated, you could no longer continue to lead those soldiers. So again, he was trying to have Caroticus excommunicated. It was also a heartfelt plea. It was a sermon, a word of comfort, obviously, to his Irish followers, and a powerful prayer to God. Copies were sent everywhere to the church leaders in Britain, fellow Christians in Ireland, etc., etc. Now, we don't know if those poor people ever saw Ireland again. What we do know is that the fact that Patrick wrote that letter was held against him, and that began a process whereby the ecclesiastic authorities in Britain wanted Patrick brought under their control, and eventually they wanted him removed. And eventually what they did was they sent a request for him to come to Britain for a review. We all know what that means. Patrick knew what it meant, so he was not going to go because he feared that if he went, that they would never allow him to come back again. So what he did was he wrote a letter to them instead. And he wrote a letter in defense of his work. And that letter is called the Confessio. And copies of both of them you can get on the internet. The Confessio, it's accepted as the work of St. Patrick. Now, there may have been some changes made as the narrative, as the origin story for Christianity was written a century or two later. But anyway, it had no title. It got its title from the end, the last few words in which he wrote that the letter is his confessio, or confession, before death. Obviously, the problem was now there's a buildup of things. The British church were angry over the letter to Caroticus. He'd been called back. At this stage, and for years, his character and work were being attacked from Britain. He was being accused of corruption, of having ulterior motives in coming to Ireland, was stated to be unfit for the job, partly because of his education, but partly because of whatever indiscretion that he had revealed in his confession. And of course, he was now also too close to the Irish. He had gone native. And he was known, they called him a filthy little pig keeper. So the Confessio, it's to give you an understanding of the way it is described. It's a selective story. It's designed to show that he was chosen by the grace of God to serve selflessly among the Irish. And he goes into all the details of his boyhood, slavery, his escape from Ireland, his dreams, the threats against him, temptations, all are included to convince the readers that he, like the Apostle Paul, was selected by God and guided by him in his work. And the best way is to show you his words. So this is what he says. Listen to me well, all of you great and small, everyone who has any fear of God, especially you wealthy landowners so proud of your education. So that was a dig at them, because the fault that they found in him was largely to do with his education. He says, listen and consider carefully. God chose foolish little me from among all of you who seem so wise and so expert in the law and so powerful in your eloquence. And again, getting at them, because he was admitting he was not an expert in the law. He wasn't powerful in eloquence. He wasn't a great speaker or an orator. But he picked our ignorant Patrick ahead of all of you, even though I am not worthy. He picked me to go forth with fear and reverence. And another dig, he says, and without any of you complaining at the time, to serve the Irish faithfully. The reason they didn't complain was, well, even though they weren't happy and didn't think he was the right man for the job, they didn't have an alternative. Also, they believed that just like Palladius, he wouldn't last any amount of time. They probably figured that in a short period of time he would be leaving, or he would be dead. But now that he'd been very, very successful, and one of the reasons, that they had a problem with him was because he wasn't giving the due recognition of the authority that the British authorities believed that they had because of their agreement with Rome. He certainly wasn't sending them back the monies and wealth that that they felt he should be contributing to them, because his approach was, I'm going to use this to build the church in Ireland. And of course, one of the things that was being said about him, he's not building the Roman church there, he's building Patrick's church. That was one of the claims against them. So he died on the 17th of March in 461. I'm sticking with that date. There are other dates that are given. And then there's another date that's given, which would have made him 120 years of age. Now, the reason that we don't believe that date is that because that was the age that Moses died. And there's a number of people who are famous within the church who also lived to be 120, because it was basically elevating you to the status of Moses by saying you lived to be 120. So anyway, we don't need to go there. He's buried in County Down, in Downpatrick. It's claimed that he was buried alongside St. Bridget and St. Columba, although that's never been proven. Maybe one of these days, somebody will be able to use DNA analysis of the soil up there and tell us the truth. So I'm going to finish off. I'm going to summarize this section because there's a lot in it. It's about St. Patrick's Day celebrations, and celebrations go on all over the world. We know people visit Ireland every year to go and climb the Croagh Patrick, which was called after him. It was originally called Croagh Con Agla, which translates to Eagle Mountain, but it was changed its name. Now, the celebrations for Patrick began around the 9th century. And what happened was the Vikings invaded Ireland. The Vikings were very much anti-Christian. And the reason for that was that in the year 800, the King of France, Charlemagne, was made the head of the Holy Roman Empire by the Pope, because the Pope needed an army, given the rise of Islam. Now, Charlemagne issued a decree, and the decree essentially boiled down to telling people, particularly in Northern Europe, where Scandinavia is, you have a choice. You can convert to Christianity or execution. So they did not like that, because they were pagans. And so when they arrived in Christian Ireland, they set about destroying anything that was Christian within Ireland. And within a very short period of time, all of the monasteries and church buildings and the rest had been destroyed. A lot of the people who worked in them, and the priests and bishops and the rest, either were killed, were sold as slaves, but some of them managed to escape to the continent, and many of them managed to escape and bring treasures from Ireland with them. Eventually, they decided to start celebrating, and Patrick then became the symbol of Ireland for all those in exile. And that began in the 9th century. Also in the 9th century in Ireland, there was an annual 3-day observance of the anniversary of the death of St. Patrick. And again, we don't know how long that lasts. We're not sure when that ended. But in the 9th century, it was a 3-day event. We know in the year 1600 that Luke Wadding managed to have his feast day placed on the universal liturgical calendar of the Catholic Church, and it became a holy day of obligation. Now, because Patrick was alive before the Reformation, Patrick was claimed by the various churches in Ireland. So the established church in Ireland was the Church of Ireland after the invasions from Britain and beginning in the 12th century. So he was honoured also by the Church of Ireland, which is part of the worldwide Anglican communion. So he was claimed by both of them. So it was a somber religious occasion, mainly prayer. Then in the 18th century, when the penal laws were introduced in Ireland, and the penal laws essentially made being Irish and being Catholic essentially illegal. But again, because the Anglican Church was celebrating Patrick, the Irish felt that they could do the same. And they began to do that wearing a big piece of shamrock attached to their clothing. And that was seen as an act of defiance. And they managed to get away with that. And that continued down through the years, even up to 1916. People were able to get out and march all over Ireland in defiance of the British. And the defiance was in the way that they celebrated Patrick. They were recognizing him for his Irishness and for his contribution to the Irish people and his role within Ireland. The color was originally blue, and then it was changed to green. The Friendly Brothers of St. Patrick, which was an Irish fraternity, they adopted green. So in 1903, it became an official holiday in Ireland. Now, they had to introduce another law requiring that the public houses, the pubs, be closed because it was too much drinking, and that lasted until the 70s, and then that law was changed, was repealed. So parades in Ireland began in 1903, and as I said earlier, in 1916, the Irish volunteers held parades. The British authorities recorded 38 St. Patrick's Day parades involving 6,000 marchers. Almost half of them were said to be armed. And then the first official state-sponsored Irish St. Patrick's Day parade in Dublin took place in 1931. In the US colony then, the first recorded celebration was in St. Augustine in Florida. That's only become known recently by Dr. Michael Francis in his 2017 research. He also discovered the first St. Patrick's Day parade was also in St. Augustine in 1601. And both were organized by the Spanish colony's Irish vicar, Richard Arthur, or Ricardo Artur. Then we know Boston and New York, had their events. There was one in Boston in 1737, and Boston had its first parade apparently in 1812. Then in 1756, there was a regiment of the British Army, which was an Irish regiment. They marched down in New York City. They were marching to the Crown and Thistle Tavern. That was the first celebration there. And then Evacuation Day was March the 17th in 1776. And on that day, Washington's general orders, he set the password and countersign as Boston and St. Patrick. In 1780, George Washington allowed his troops a holiday on March the 17th, a day that became known as St. Patrick's Day Encampment of 1780. And by the late 1860s, after the arrival of probably the best part of 1 million Irish people, over a dozen American cities had large St. Patrick's Day parades. And as we know, 10 years later, the Irish were the majority of the population in New York. Just a little story about his crozier, or on Bakal Isa, which translates into the staff of Jesus. It was made of wood. We know that it was a symbol of Patrick's authority, and he had it. He had an elaborate casing made for it by his goldsmith, who became a saint, Saint Tussock. Now, we have a description of it from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He describes it as being covered with gold and adorned with the most costly gems. It was a national relic. Oaths and treaties were signed on it, and it survived storms and invasions. But it didn't survive the Reformation. It was tragically and sacrilegiously destroyed during Henry VIII's Reformation in the 1500s. It was taken out and burnt in public in front of Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. Now, Montserrat is in the Caribbean, and it's the only nation outside of Ireland that celebrates St. Patrick's Day as a national holiday. And that's because the island was populated by Irish and Africans in the 1650s. I've run over my time a bit. I'm an Irish historian, and I have online Irish classes. I have two programs. One is the history of every county in Ireland, and I do one a month. There's 32 counties. I also do a chronological history of Ireland from the beginning, which was 431 million years ago, and I bring it up to today. In March, I've already started these ones, the history of County Down and the Easter Rising in 1916. And then next month, I have the history of County Antrim and the rise of Sinn Féin and the War of Independence. They're all presented live on Zoom. If you get a copy of this presentation, I have references here. You can find it yourself easy enough. That movie that I mentioned about St. Patrick, you can get it on YouTube. And there are other resources as well, including I have a bibliography here. So with that being said, I will take any questions that you have. That's my email address if anybody wishes to contact me.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Sean. Wonderful presentation as expected. I think at the high point, we had over 50 people watching live, which is wonderful. Let me see here. B says, interesting program. Thank you. Please invite the speaker back for another program. Eileen says, I too would very much like to hear the speaker again. Very engaging presentation. Debbie says, very informative. Thank you. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Sandra says, thank you. Enjoyed. Please come back with more of Ireland. Nancy says, thank you, Sean Murphy, for a very informative presentation. Happy St. Patrick's Day. So that's really it. We didn't have too many questions. Does anyone have any questions? If so, please get them into the chat now. As Sean said, shoot him an email if you have any questions about his online history classes that he teaches.
Yeah, I mean, feel free to answer, to ask any question or to make any comments. Because the subject itself, I mean, I could spend a month, on this, on what I've just given you in an hour. So I've kind of swept, over this, and there's so much, packed in there. I can understand difficult to come to grasp with it all, because I could break that down into 5 or 6, lessons in it, in itself. But still, if I can help you with your understanding, please, ask.
Yeah. Julie says, yes, please come back. Thank you. So easy to listen to, and history is fun. Gail says, thank you as well. Well, Sean, we'll wrap it there. And then if anyone has any questions, they can follow up with you via email. Patricia says, thank you. This was packed full of information. All right. Sean, what are you doing to celebrate St. Patrick's Day today?
Well, I've got another presentation, and then tonight I'm an Irish musician as well, so I'll be going out to play some Irish music. And in case any of you are down on Cape Cod, I run an Irish traditional session in O'Shea's Old Inn in West Dennis. So if you're ever around, come down to the session. We have a great music there on Sunday nights. Well, it's kind of afternoon, 4:30 to 7 o'clock in the evening. I also teach Irish dancing for adults, set dancing. So if any,
what don't you do, Sean? You seem to do it all.
Well,
all right,
thank you for inviting me, and certainly I am more than happy to come and talk. In fact, I'll send you a list of all the presentations that I do, and if you're interested in one of them, please let me know.
Great. Yeah, please do. So thank you all so much for joining us. I'll look for an email for me tomorrow with a link to the recording, link to the feedback survey, and some information about some upcoming programs that may be of interest. By the way, tonight at 7 o'clock, the Tewksbury Library is partnering with the Chelmsford Library and a few others in the area for a talk on the history of Irish food. And that's with a culinary historian, Sarah Lohman, I believe her name is. So anyway, information about that can be found on the Tewksbury Library's online calendar, www.tewksburypl.org. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Thank you, Sean. Have a good day.
Okay, Robert, thank you.
Yep.